Nazi Germany has fallen. What started as a proposed 1,000-year Reich barely lasted 13 years and was finally destroyed in 1945. After Allied forces defeated Nazi Germany in World War II, Europe became a dangerous place to be associated with the Nazi regime. Thousands of Nazi officers, high-ranking party members, and supporters of Hitler began to flee Germany and search for safety across the Atlantic. After January 1945, German dictator Adolf Hitler never left the chancellery in Berlin, remaining in its bunker, abandoning any final leadership plans. He frequently became resentful while claiming he had been betrayed by those he had trusted. His first betrayal was defined by Heinrich Himmler, attempting to negotiate terms of surrender for Germany with the Western Allies, excluding Russia. Of course, this was unsuccessful. After the failure of this negotiation, Himmler flees Germany and becomes untraceable.
Heinrich Himmler is one of the most pivotal figures in the Third Reich, and he's most famous for being the head of the SS. Now, that is the Nazi elite armed force. It's not part of the army. It's originally called the Schutzstaffel, the protection squad that's just there to protect Hitler. And what Himmler does from, almost from the beginning is to build the SS up into a state within a state, because by the height of Nazi power, Himmler is in charge of an organization that has a kind of civil side to it, an administrative side to it, which is huge and has fingers in so many pies, and also the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, which is there to help fight the war. And its troops are notorious for being some of the most sort of kind of evil and deadly troops, as part of the war. And what the SS also runs is the whole concentration camp network. So it's the SS men doing not only the exterminations, but they're also the ones who are appropriating wealth from the Jews and all the other slaves being used, and appropriating all the stuff that they own, and also selling this workforce to big German industries who are paying for its use, and all that is going into the pockets of the SS. You would have thought that a man with that much power might look like a very impressive figure, but Heinrich Himmler was not an impressive figure. Himmler, like Hitler, looked like the very inverse of the kind of Aryan, blonde, 6'5" tall superhuman. He was a very short man, sort of weak jawline, very ugly, sort of pebble glasses, former chicken farmer. He looked very, very unimpressive.
Hermann Goering is Hitler's second betrayer, after sending a telegram to the Führer proposing he take complete control of Germany, leading to Hitler's fury. He dismissed his once time-confident and ordered Goering's arrest immediately.
He goes from being a First World War fighter pilot hero who's got the Pour le Mérite medal, which is the highest medal that can be won by the German fighting man, who then kind of loses his way somewhat. And then when he falls in with the Nazis in Munich in the 20s, he's feeling that's giving him a kind of sense of purpose.
In a state of nervous exhaustion, Hitler finally accepts the inevitability of defeat and makes preparations to take his own life alongside his new wife, Eva Braun.
Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the center of Berlin, are kind of terrible. end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler, who then gets married to his long-term girlfriend, Eva Braun, in this sort of kind of bizarre ceremony. And then just a few days later, Hitler, on the 30th of April, 1945, decides to take his own life, and Eva Braun is going to do the same thing with him, or Eva Hitler, as of course she became.
On April 30th, around 3:30 a.m., the sound of a gunshot came from Hitler's quarters. Hitler and Eva Braun had committed suicide.
Their bodies are then removed by some loyal SS men, his adjutant, and they are taken out in what passes now for a garden in the Reich Chancellery, but of course it's just a kind of pockmarked hellhole of artillery shells. And there they are, their bodies are burnt in this great kind of almost like a sort of Viking pyre, like a Viking longship going up.
After the death of the Fuhrer, remaining supporters of Hitler found it hard to remain in Europe and went on the run to escape their fates if captured by the Allies. The Allied forces, Britain, France, the United States, and Russia, agreed to prosecute any living Nazi Party officials for their crimes.
Even during the Second World War, it was realized by the Allies that it was absolutely vital that Nazi war criminals should be brought to justice. In 1943, there was this thing called the Moscow Declaration that announced that all these criminals would be chased, quote, to the utmost ends of the earth and brought to justice. Now, this was to achieve two things. First, to tell any Nazi war criminal, you know, we're on to you. You're not going to get away with what you're doing because we're going to win this war, and then we're going to come and find you, and then we're going to come and bring you to justice. And also the people in the occupied territories could see the Moscow Declaration and go, good, the Allies are going to do something about this, and it means that these people may commit fewer criminal acts against us if they're worried that when the war's over, the Allies are going to come and get them.
Of course, Hitler, together with his long-standing partner and at the very end his wife, Eva Braun, committed suicide on the 30th of April, 1945. There was then the question about who were they going to bring to trial.
On the evening of May 1st, Magda Goebbels, wife of the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, put their 6 children to bed, having first given them a sleeping potion and possibly morphine. Then, with the help of a doctor, she put drops of hydrogen cyanide down their throats. All died instantly, with only the eldest 12-year-old Helga putting up a struggle. Later that day, Joseph and Magda Goebbels took their own lives, supposedly unable to continue living without their Fuhrer. On October 18, 1945, the Nuremberg trials began, indicting 24 Nazi officials on 4 charges: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit all those crimes. After much debate, 24 defendants were chosen to represent a cross-section of Nazi diplomatic, economic, political, and military leadership. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels could not be tried because they committed suicide at the war's end or soon afterwards.
What Nuremberg represents to so many of these Nazis is a real reckoning that they never thought they were going to receive. Maybe some of the smarter ones in the dying days of the war thought maybe, but actually the whole idea of the Reich was not meant to be a 12-year Reich, it was supposed to be a 1,000-year Reich. And in fact, that what was going to happen is that people were going to be treating them as demigods, and statues would be erected and buildings enshrined to them, you know, for hundreds of years, not actually hanging from some grubby rope in the prison courtyard in Nuremberg, which is what happened to them. So they went from kind of being demigods to criminal lowlife very quickly.
The Nuremberg trials represented a very important, unprecedented moment and a way for the Allied powers really to bring to justice some of those key Nazi leaders as representatives of key Nazi organizations who had carried out such unspeakably cruel acts of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against the peace.
It was very radical at the time. There had never been an international criminal court like it. And so this was a kind of coming together of a lot of different legal systems, a lot of different political systems. But what it was saying to the world was, listen, these people who commit war crimes, these people who commit genocide, these people who commit crimes against humanity, they are never, ever going to get away with it ever again.
Hermann Goering was the highest-ranking Nazi official among the defendants, after trying to flee after hearing of Hitler's anger towards him, before he subsequently committed suicide. Although many of the 24 Nazi officials had tried to run, they had been stopped, captured, and brought to trial. Martin Bormann, known among the inner circle as Hitler's shadow, was still missing, but put on trial in absentia. Although it seemed that some of the key officials had been brought to trial, 3 notorious Nazis had managed to slip through the cracks and were escaping justice. These 3 men were Rudolf Höss, Adolf Eichmann, and Joseph Mengele. Rudolf Höss knew he was being hunted, but escaped to Berlin and made it out to the German countryside after being advised to flee before the German surrender by his higher-in-command, Heinrich Himmler.
Rudolf Höss had been a member of the SS since 1934, and he came to take his main position, most well-known position, as commandant at Auschwitz between 1940 and 1943.
One of the most barbaric figures of the entire Third Reich, and as a result has probably got about 1 million people against his name who he had murdered.
He typified the quiet and bureaucratic mass murderer, very conscientious, very determined to do his job and to do it well, and of course without much thought for the victims. In terms of what he was doing at Auschwitz, trying to make a very efficient machine and trying to do his job well and properly, his concern was not with the victims, but just to make sure that the apparatus was working well. So in this case, to ensure that the gas chambers could operate efficiently. He treated the mass murder that went on there just as a kind of routine and ordinary business as usual, really, very much as a kind of ordinary procedure and process.
Adolf Eichmann was mentioned throughout the questioning in the Nuremberg trials, but had successfully escaped to northern Germany before obtaining an Argentinian visa and fleeing overseas.
You've got a lot of extremely worried senior Nazis, and also a lot of worried, basically, mid-ranking Nazis. And one of the most notorious of these mid-ranking Nazis is an SS colonel by the name of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann today is an incredibly notorious name, and we all today know him to be the man he was. He's famously and notoriously called the architect of the final solution. What he was in charge of a department of the Reich Security Main Office, and it was called Department 4B4. It was part of the Gestapo, the secret state police, and his job was to basically wage war against the Jews. And it was Eichmann's job was to help facilitate the destruction of the Jewish people. And that is why he's called the architect of the Holocaust. He was effectively the guy, didn't come up with the policy, but he was the guy who zealously implemented it. And he knew that if he was captured, he would face the noose.
Eichmann was arrested at the end of the war, but his name wasn't very well known at that stage. He managed to escape from an American internment camp in 1946.
Notorious Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele was also on the run at this time, using hidden rat lines to escape Germany, headed for Genoa.
Joseph Mengele was a Nazi figure who today we regard as being one of the most notorious in the entire regime. As a doctor in Auschwitz, he had power of life and death over hundreds of thousands of people, and he committed the most vile experiments. And so he knew at the end of the war that he would have to go into hiding, because there would be people who had survived Auschwitz who would be giving testimony about his savagery and his barbarism.
Josef Mengele was absolutely convinced by Nazi ideology. He became very well known on the arrivals ramp at Auschwitz. So when the trainloads of new prisoners arrived, he could be seen there in a very callous and matter-of-fact manner, directing the new arrivals straight to the gas chambers or to work duties.
Now, when the Russians come to Auschwitz in January 1945, yes, they find a load of kind of living skeletons, if you like, but what they don't do is find people like Joseph Mengele, because he's got out. He knows what he's done is wrong, otherwise why would he want to escape? He ends up working, along with sort of normal farm labourers, but it's clear he's a much more intellectual figure than those around him. They all know that he's, got something to hide.
Rudolf Hess managed to keep a low profile as a gardener in Gottrupel, Germany. Initially, his disguise had fooled his neighbors, until British soldiers arrived to question him after receiving a tip-off to his whereabouts. Despite having a family also in hiding, the soldiers pressed Hess to give up his true identity, threatening the safety of his wife and son. After removing his wedding ring, the soldiers found his name inscribed inside and confirmed this was the missing Nazi officer they were looking for.
He's eventually picked up by the British, who've actually interrogated his wife, who's actually terrified that she's going to be tortured by the Brits, and she's basically spilled the beans. So Hearst is brought to justice. And there is this extraordinary image of a British war crimes officer actually confronting Hearst, who looks like this completely pathetic figure, looking absolutely terrified, while this sort of tall British army officer is just basically shouting at him. And it shows, basically this man who had power of life and death over millions of people is reduced to this pathetic figure. Now the British hand him over to the Poles, and it's the Poles who actually bring him to justice, and it's the Poles who hang him.
On April 15, 1946, Rudolf Hess testified at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, giving a detailed account of his crimes. He also delivered damning evidence about Adolf Eichmann, making the urge to find him more vital. The tribunal questioned him about his role at Auschwitz and the final solution. Another chance at freedom was looking unlikely as the tribunal uncovered further evidence to prosecute him for his crimes against humanity.
We had 2 SS doctors on duty at Auschwitz to examine the incoming transports of prisoners. Prisoners would be marched past one of the doctors, who would make spot decisions as they walked by. Those who were fit for work were sent into the camp, others were sent immediately to the extermination plant. Children of tender years were invariably exterminated, since by reasons of their youth they were unable to work. We endeavored to fool them into thinking they were to go through a delousing process. It took from 3 to 15 minutes to kill the people in the death chamber, depending upon climatic conditions. We knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. We usually waited about 1/2 hour before we opened the doors and removed the bodies. After the bodies were removed, our special commandos took off the rings and extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses.
Adolf Eichmann initially found work in the forest industry and later leased a small plot of land in northern Germany, where he lived until 1950. Worried that he was being spied on, he obtained an Argentinian visa. He signed an application for a falsified Red Cross passport with the help of an Austrian bishop known for his Nazi sympathies. Eichmann had traveled across Europe, staying in different monasteries that had been set up as safe houses, before also departing from Genoa on a ship headed for Buenos Aires on June 17, 1949. Arriving in Buenos Aires on July 14, 1949, Adolf Eichmann believed he had escaped Judgment Day. He worked for a Mercedes-Benz automotive plant under the alias Ricardo Clement. However, several survivors of the Holocaust dedicated themselves to finding Eichmann. Someone had spotted Eichmann in Buenos Aires and tipped off the Israeli consulate in Vienna in 1954. After some extensive investigation and watching Eichmann closely, a team moved towards his location, ready to capture the architect of the final solution. Adolf Eichmann was captured on May 11, 1960, near his home on Garibaldi Street in San Fernando, Buenos Aires. Agents had been watching him nearby since April. Observing his daily routine, they picked a time which they deemed best to attack and capture Eichmann unexpectedly.
I would say a symbolic punishment according to certain moral and legal principles. But the main aim is not whether Eichmann would get shot or hanged. The main point is that Eichmann should be exposed, and through Eichmann, Nazism. Most of us, would prefer not to have him killed, because we are fundamentally, the Argentinians, are against capital punishment. In principle, we are educated that way. We condemn capital punishment.
Eichmann's trial before a special tribunal of the Jerusalem District Court began on April 11, 1961. The legal basis for the charges against Eichmann was the 1950 Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law, which allowed Israeli courts to punish Nazi perpetrators for crimes against Jews during World War II. Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner signed a bill of indictment against Eichmann on 15 counts, including crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity.
Behind this fence, the pages of history are being turned back to one of the most terrible chapters of our time. Adolf Eichmann faces probably the most appalling list of charges ever to be leveled against a single human being. But if Eichmann's is the name on the charge sheet, the Israelis have made very clear who they think is really in the dock. In the building where Eichmann is being tried, the Israelis are trying to place before the conscience of the world the full facts of how the Nazis in Germany tried literally to exterminate millions of the Jewish people in Europe. Now, to us, the Nazi persecution is 15 years or more away. But to the people living here, it's still a sharp memory. The children playing in the warm spring sunshine, the older people going about their everyday lives. Many of them had relatives who died in Hitler's gas ovens. And even here in Israel, they found no peaceful haven. Just over a mile up the road from here, there's a barbed wire fence, and sentries stand guard. This is the border across which Israel looks to an implacably hostile Arab neighbor. To the people of Israel, persecution, personified by Eichmann, is still a living danger. Or now in this city of Jerusalem, which itself is no stranger to history, let us look back at the moment when this historic trial began.
Eichmann, testifying from behind the glass booth to protect him from possible assassination, asserted that he had not dictated policy but only carried it out, that he was merely a little cog in the machinery of destruction.
In Jerusalem, the trial of Adolf Eichmann begins, reviving memories of the Nazi horrors of the Second World War. Entering the bulletproof prisoner's box is the man charged with the annihilation of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps. Searching problems of conscience and of international law will be raised by this trial, one of the most stirring of modern times. Eichmann himself is impassive as the three judges who will decide his fate enter. Now, after 15 years in hiding, and 1 year after his sensational abduction from Argentina, Adolf Eichmann is indicted on 15 counts of crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity.
Accused together with others during the period 1939 to 1945, caused the killing of millions of Jews in his capacity as the person responsible for the execution of the Nazi plan for the physical extermination of the Jews, known as the final solution of the Jewish problem.
Eichmann's attorney, Dr. Robert Servatius, opens by denying the legality of the trial and questions the jurisdiction obtained by Eichmann's forcible capture. Dr. Servatius further suggests that Eichmann be tried by a neutral or international tribunal. Israeli Attorney General Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, replies that no one except the State of Israel has sought to bring Eichmann to justice, and cites the Nuremberg war crimes trials as precedent for this trial. Throughout, Eichmann remains icy calm, his fate at last in the scales of justice.
The trial, which opened in April 1961, was very controversial, but it also, of course, attracted a great deal of international attention as well. When he was questioned, he claimed that he was only following orders. He claimed not to be responsible for any of the executions and said he was just involved in transportation. So again, that's the kind of line used about following orders and not really admitting responsibility for the final solution.
This is the indictment against you presented by the Attorney General. Adolf, the son of Adolf Karl Eichmann, is accused hereby.
First count, nature of offense, crime against the Jewish people, an offense under Section 1A1 of the Nazis and Nazi Collaborators Punishment Law 5710, 1950, and Section 23 of the Criminal Code Ordinance 1936. Particulars of offense. The accused, together with others, during the period 1939 to 1945, caused the killing of millions of Jews in his capacity as the person responsible for the execution of the Nazi plan for the physical extermination of the Jews, known as the final solution of the Jewish problem. Immediately after the outbreak of the Second World War, the accused was appointed head of a department of the Gestapo in Berlin, the duties of which were to locate, deport, and exterminate the Jews of Germany and the other Axis countries, and the Jews of occupied areas. That department bore in succession the following distinctive numbers: 4D4, 4B4, 4A4. I request silence in court. C. Instructions for the execution of the plan of extermination in Germany were given by the accused directly to local commanders of the Gestapo, while in Berlin, Vienna, and Prague, the instructions of the accused were issued to central authorities, Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, for the direction of which the accused was personally responsible until their liquidation towards the end of the Second World War. D. In areas occupied by Germany, the accused acted through the offices of the commanders of the security police and the SD, and through those persons specially nominated to deal with Jewish affairs, who were appointed from the department of the accused in the Gestapo and were subject to his instructions. E. In Axis countries and areas conquered by them, the accused made use of the offices of the diplomatic representatives of Germany in each place, in continual coordination with the special departments of the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, which dealt with the Jewish problem. Advisors were appointed in the offices of such diplomatic representatives from among members of the department of the accused who were subject to his instructions. F. The accused, together with others, secured the extermination of the Jews by, among other means, their being killed in concentration camps, the purpose of which was mass murder, the more important of such camps being as follows. Auschwitz. Millions of Jews were exterminated in this camp from 1941 until the end of January 1945, in gas chambers and in crematoria, and by shooting and hanging. The accused directed the commanders of that camp to use gas known as Cyclone B, and in 1942 and 1944, the accused also secured the supply of a quantity of gas for the extermination of the Jews. G. Immediately after the invasion of Poland by the German army in September 1939, the accused committed acts of expelling, uprooting, and exterminating the population in coordination with massacre squads recruited from the ranks of the German security police and the SS, which were known by the name of operational groups, Einsatzgruppen. H. Before the invasion by the German army of areas of Russia and the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which were annexed to Russia, 4 operational groups were organized by the Reich Security Head Office, RSHA, which cooperated with the accused in the extermination of Jews in the areas referred to, and in that portion of Poland which was annexed to Russia after September 1939. I. At the end of 1941, the accused ordered the deportation of thousands of Jews from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, Protectorate, to ghettos in Riga, Kovno, and Minsk. These Jews were exterminated, and inter alia, 1. A number of such Jews deported from the Reich, Germany, were murdered on the 30th of November 1941, together with some 4,000 Jews from Riga. 2. Some 3,500 Jews from Germany who were sent to Minsk, as aforesaid, pursuant to instructions issued by the accused, were exterminated by an operational group in Byalo, Russia, together with 55,000 more Jews who were residents of that district. J. During the years 1940 to 1945, the accused, together with others, caused the killing of hundreds of thousands of Jews in forced labor camps, which were conducted in the lines of concentration camps, and in which such Jews were enslaved, tortured, and starved to death in Germany and in countries occupied by Germany. K. The accused, together with others, caused the killing of still more hundreds of thousands of Jews during the years 1939 to 1945 in Germany and the other Axis countries and the areas occupied by them, by their mass deportation and concentration in ghettos and other concentration points under cruel and inhuman conditions. L. The accused caused the killing of some 500,000 Hungarian Jews by means of their mass deportation to the extermination camp at Auschwitz and other places during the period from the 19th of March 1944 to the 24th of December 1944, at a time when he acted as head of the Eichmann Special Operations Unit, Sondereinsatzkommando Eichmann in Budapest. All the acts mentioned in this count were committed by the accused with the intention of destroying the Jewish people.
Yes. With regard to the Jews, my only obligations were those concerned with emigration, and this transpires from the official designation of the department, which was called emigration and evacuation. Emigration, that applied to the Jews, while evacuation, that concerned the sphere of jurisdiction of the Reichskommissar for strengthening the basis of the German nation, a post to which Himmler was then appointed. And this concerned the evacuation of the newly annexed areas in the east, which were annexed to the Reich. And as Hitler and Himmler had ordered at that time, these areas had to be evacuated of Jews and other foreign nationalities. And my connection with this was strictly from the point of view of timetables and technical transport problems.
Im Einzelnen ist mir diese Sache heute nicht mehr gegenwärtig, Herr Präsident, aber ich weiß, dass die Herren beisammengesessen sind und haben hier eben in sehr unverblümten Worten, nicht in den Worten, wie ich sie dann ins Protokoll geben musste, sondern in sehr unverblümten Worten die Sache genannt, wie sie eben, ohne sie zu umschreiben.
I do not remember it in detail, Your Honor. I do not remember the circumstances of this conversation, but I do know that these gentlemen were standing together or sitting together and were discussing this subject quite bluntly, quite differently from the language which I had to use later in the record. During the conversation, they minced no words about it at all.
Der Stuckart, den man immer als einen sehr genauen und sehr heiklen Gesetzesonkel betrachtete. Und da hier war eben der Ton und die ganzen Formulierungen waren hier sehr unparagraphenmäßig gewesen. Das ist das Einzige, möchte ich sagen, dass mir noch effektiv dieserhalb im Gedächtnis haften geblieben ist.
I might say furthermore, Your Honor, that I would not have remembered this unless I had later remembered that I told myself, look here, I told myself, even this guy Stuckart, who was known as one of these uncles who was a great stickler for legalities, he too uses language which is not at all in accordance with the spirit of paragraphs of the law. This incident remained engraved in my memory and recalls the entire subject to my mind.
Although Eichmann followed the common plea of Nazi perpetrators that he was only following the orders of others, the judges concluded that Eichmann had been a critical perpetrator in the genocide. On December 12, 1961, Adolf Eichmann was found guilty of several of the charges asserted in the original indictment, and on December 15th, sentenced to death. On June 1, 1962, Eichmann was executed by hanging. After previously finding work as a farmhand in Bavaria, Joseph Mengele realized his time to escape Germany was running out after being convinced he would face a death sentence if captured.
He ends up working, along with sort of normal farm labourers. But it's clear he's a much more intellectual figure than those around him. They all know that he's, got something to hide.
Mengele obtained a falsified Red Cross passport in Genoa under the alias Helmut Gregor and sailed to Argentina in July 1949. Once settled, Joseph Mengele found work as a carpenter in Buenos Aires, whilst lodging in a boarding house. He next worked as a salesman for his family's farm equipment company, Carl Mengele & Sons. And in 1951, he began making frequent trips to Paraguay as a regional sales representative.
The Mengele family produced farm machinery in southern Germany for decades, and so effectively the family were millionaires. And so when Mengele decides to hot-foot it to Argentina in 1949, he's got the backing of a family fortune to really help smooth his way over there.
After obtaining a copy of his birth certificate through the West German Embassy in 1956, Mengele was issued an Argentine foreign residence permit under his real name. It seemed he was managing to live peacefully, hidden in plain sight. Mengele's name was mentioned several times during the Nuremberg trials in the mid-1940s, but the Allied forces believed he was probably already dead. Despite having provided Mengele with legal documents using his real name in 1956, West Germany was now offering a reward for his capture. Continuing newspaper coverage of his wartime activities and accompanying photographs led to the fugitive to relocate again in 1960. Former Nazi pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel contacted Mengele and connected him with the Nazi supporter Wolfgang Gerhardt, who helped Mengele cross the border into Brazil. He stayed with Gerhardt on his farm near São Paulo until more permanent accommodation could be found. Once again, the angel of death had made a lucky escape.
What's really chilling about Mengele is that throughout the rest of his life, he always would justify what he had done in Auschwitz. He had always thought he had done the morally correct thing. And he would see his work on the selection ramps, for starters, saying to people, you know, well, you're going to live and you're going to die. You know, we see that as sending people to their deaths. Mengele saw that as sending people to their continued life, because he had this attitude that everybody there was going to die anyway. So in fact, he was, you know, kind of delaying their deaths. He was being the nice guy. You know, that's absurd. And he also would say that the experiments he did were for the good of humanity, that this was an essential role of medicine, was to experiment on people. It was ultimately beneficial. You know, he would come up with all sorts of kind of pseudo-academic kind of verbiage to kind of justify what he had done.
In 1979, the body of a man was found floating off of Bertioga on the Brazilian coast and was pronounced dead at the scene. The man was identified as Wolfgang Gerhardt, a local farm owner, and it was reported he had suffered a stroke while swimming and drowned. He was buried in São Paulo. Despite this man being buried without question, on May 31st, 1985, West German intelligence received information that someone knew the location of Joseph Mengele. They raided the home of one of Mengele's lifelong friends and found an address book and letters in the home from none other than Mengele himself. Under interrogation, Sedlmayr revealed that Joseph Mengele had died and told German intelligence where his body was hidden. The location given by Sedlmayr took them to the grave of Wolfgang Gerhardt. Desperate to find the truth, the remains were exhumed and tested to confirm it was, in fact, Josef Mengele. Mengele's health had been deteriorating since 1972. He suffered a stroke in 1976, which destroyed his health further. On February 7th, whilst visiting friends in the coastal resort of Bertioga, Josef Mengele suffered another stroke whilst swimming and drowned. Since he had been using another identity at the time, he was buried under the falsified name Wolfgang Gerhardt. His death wasn't verified until his remains were forensically tested in 1985.
It took a long time for the German people to really come to terms with what had been done in their name. I think a lot of German people throughout the war had more than an inkling, but I don't think they knew the extent of the savagery of what went on, behind those miles upon miles of barbed wire and inside those huts and inside those chambers of death, effectively. And I think that when it was finally revealed to them and when, justice started being done, I think any reasonable German started realizing that actually, yes, there should be some form of retribution. But I think also there was also a feeling, not just in Germany, but also amongst the Allies, that you couldn't spend decade upon decade carrying out tens of thousands of manhunts for all these people. I think you've also got a feeling, not just in Germany, but also in the former Allied nations, that actually it's time to move on. By the late 1940s, you've got a decision. Do we keep chasing hundreds of thousands of war criminals? Do we keep having these trials? Do we keep having this retribution? Because soon, people are going to ask, what crimes did we commit on the Allied side? You've got a very strong sense in Germany, and indeed in the former Allied nations, Britain, America, France, you name it, that actually by the end of the 1940s, you can't just have these endless manhunts and war crimes trials going on for decade after decade. You've actually got to rebuild Germany. You've got to have a prosperous Germany in the middle of Europe. You've also got a new enemy in the form of the Soviet Union. You've all got to work together. And it's pretty hard to work together if you keep having retributive justice going on in the country of your new friend. It ain't going to work, frankly. And so by 1949, for example, the British War Crimes Unit is simply wound up after only 4 years. They've only brought a relative handful of Nazis to justice. There's still tons of thousands of them out there. Many of them remained free for decades. Or if they received sentences, those sentences got less and less severe as the years went by. So if you were captured in 1946, you may have hanged. If you were captured in 1956, you may have got a couple of years in prison. So you see this diminution. Actually, a lot of Nazis got away with it scot-free.